There are places in this world where the shadows lie a little longer, where the geography itself seems to guard secrets. In the deep, folded heart of the Appalachian Mountains, silence isn't just an absence of sound, it's a presence. And in the autumn of 1967, in one of these forgotten hollows of McDowell County, that silence was finally broken, and it screamed. This is not just a story of poverty. This is not merely a tale of isolation. This is a chronicle of a family tree that, instead of branching towards the sun, twisted in upon itself, growing downwards into a darkness so profound it would warp flesh and shatter minds. This is the story of the Blackwood lineage. A story that begins not with a question, but with a whisper on the wind, a whisper about children who didn't look quite right. The complaints were vague, as they often are in remote places. Whispers of strange-looking young uns with hollow eyes, seen only on rare, furtive trips to the isolated town of Welsh. Whispers that were easy to ignore, until they weren't. Until they painted a picture so unsettling that Sheriff Robert Tanner could no longer look away. This is not a sensational headline, but a grim reality unearthed in the isolated, shadowed hollows of the Appalachian Mountains. In 1967, a truth more disturbing than any fiction was dragged into the light. Following uneasy whispers from concerned neighbors, local authorities in McDowell County crossed onto a desolate property, uncovering what would become known as one of the most grotesque records of consanguineous union in modern American history. The case of the Blackwood family festered in one of the nation's most impoverished regions, a secret kept by deep valleys and dense, suffocating forests. Their domain was a 2-hour journey from any urban center, reached by a dirt road that became a muddy, impassable tomb during the rigorous winter months. This geographical isolation was merely the surface of a much deeper, more profound separation from the world. On a cold October morning, when the fog clung to the mountains like a shroud, Sheriff Tanner, along with 2 social workers, made the 2-hour journey down a road that was little more than a scar on the land. They were entering a place time had forgotten. A property so isolated it felt less like a home and more like a separate, secret world. Sheriff Robert Tanner and 2 social workers arrived at the property. They came investigating complaints about strange, pallid children rarely glimpsed during the family's infrequent trips to the town of Welsh for supplies. What they found would challenge the very limits of their comprehension. What they found was a cluster of buildings held together by little more than habit and decay. A main house, slumped with age, and 3 small cabins scattered around it like graves. But the true shock wasn't the buildings, it was the number of souls emerging from them. 23 people. A small crowd living in a space meant for a few. And at the center of it all stood the patriarch, 76-year-old Jeremiah Blackwood, a man with eyes that held no light, only a kind of weathered, defensive defiance. The initial exchanges were a maze of evasions. Names and relationships were blurred, identities shifted like the mountain mist. But then, the sheriff pointed to a young woman standing close to Jeremiah. "And who is this?" Jeremiah's answer came without a hint of shame or hesitation, a statement of fact from a different moral universe. "This is Clara. My wife." But Clara was not just his wife. She was his granddaughter. And as the investigation peeled back the layers of this nightmare, an even more grotesque truth was unearthed. There was another girl, Abigail. She was Jeremiah's great-granddaughter, a child born from his union with Clara. The Blackwood family tree was a closed loop, a serpent eating its own tail for generations. The physical evidence of this inward spiraling bloodline was written on the bodies of the family. Of the 23 inhabitants, 17 bore the unmistakable stigmata of profound genetic decay. Severe strabismus turned eyes into wandering, unseeing orbs. Limbs were twisted and disproportionate. Cognitive abilities were shattered, teenagers who could barely form a sentence, their minds trapped in a perpetual fog. Social worker Martha Collins would later recall, her voice still heavy with the memory, the most disturbing thing was not the deformities themselves, it was the absolute, suffocating system Jeremiah had built. The children weren't just isolated, they were spiritually imprisoned. They believed this was normal. They believed the outside world was a place of monsters, never knowing the true monster was the man who called himself their protector. The origins of this horror stretched back to the early 1900s, to Jeremiah's father, William, who fled to these mountains carrying his own dark secrets, rumors of a relationship with a sister. The isolation was a deliberate fortress. And when Jeremiah took control, he didn't just maintain the walls, he reinforced them with a twisted theology. He preached a gospel of purity, a grotesque perversion of eugenics, convincing his flock that their incestuous unions were preserving a superior bloodline. He created his own Bible, his own God, and his own hell, all within the confines of this shadowed valley. You are watching this because you understand that true horror isn't always a ghost or a monster. Sometimes, it's a quiet, growing thing in the dark, fed by silence and neglect. Subscribe to this channel if you believe these obscured histories need to be dragged, kicking and screaming, into the light. The discovery of the Blackwoods was a crack in the foundation of our civilized world, revealing a festering truth about the extremes of isolation. But the true terror was only beginning. For when the medical teams arrived from the University of Western Virginia, they would discover that the psychological and genetic damage was far deeper, far more chilling, than anyone could have imagined. A visibly deteriorated wooden house stood at the center, surrounded by 3 small cabins. Within this confined space dwelled 23 souls, a shocking number given the modest, decaying structures. The patriarch was Jeremiah Blackwood, then 76 years old. The first suspicions were raised by evasive, circular answers about the identities of those living there. When the sheriff pointed to a young woman at Jeremiah's side, the old man stated without hesitation, "This is Clara, my wife." Only through persistent investigation did the horrifying truth surface. Clara was, in fact, his own granddaughter. And the horror deepened. Subsequent revelations showed Jeremiah was also in a relationship with Abigail, his great-granddaughter, a child born from his union with Clara. The Blackwood family tree was not a tree at all, but a tangled, parasitic vine. Geneticists who later studied the case would have to devise new models to chart the warped relationships. Among the 23 inhabitants, 17 bore obvious physical deformities, severe strabismus, twisted and disproportionate limbs, and cognitive capacities so limited they could barely form complete phrases. Social workers noted classic signs of generational decay, abnormal spinal curvatures and fused fingers. These were the direct consequences of generations of poisonous crosses. The most disturbing aspect, noted Martha Collins, one of the social workers, was not merely the physical conditions, but the comprehensive system of isolation Jeremiah had engineered. The children had never attended school, never seen a doctor, and were raised to believe their monstrous way of life was the only one that existed. The origins of this horror stretched back to the early 1900s when William Blackwood, Jeremiah's father, settled in the region after fleeing rumors of his own relationship with a sister. The isolation was a deliberate shield against judgment. When Jeremiah assumed control after his father's death in 1932, he deepened the darkness. He forbade contact with outsiders, propagating a twisted belief that they were creating a pure, superior lineage, a grotesque perversion of eugenic theories. Check to see if you're subscribed to this channel. You need to hear these obscure stories, the ones that reveal the dark underbelly of American society that history books try to bury. Each case we uncover brings to light truths many would prefer to keep forgotten. The discovery of the Blackwood family was not a mere anomaly. It was a disturbing reflection of practices that, though rarely spoken of, festered in other isolated Appalachian communities throughout the 20th century. Geographical isolation, extreme poverty, and a profound lack of education created a petri dish for such horrors to multiply. Even more chilling was the tacit awareness of some neighbors, who chose the comfort of silence over the burden of intervention, an accomplice's quiet that allowed generations to suffer. When authorities finally breached the property, a complex operation began to untangle the relationships and plan the next steps. In our next chapter, we will witness the medical community's shock at the genetic devastation, the challenges of integrating these broken souls into society, and the first, fragile testimonies from the victims themselves. When a medical team from the University of Western Virginia arrived in McDowell County, Dr. Harold Richardson, a leading geneticist, was unprepared for the spectacle of decay. He described it as one of the most extreme examples of inbreeding depression ever documented. Initial exams confirmed 17 family members had severe genetic conditions, polydactyly, microcephaly, and IQs ranging from 40 to 70. What we are witnessing is the cumulative result of at least 4 generations of consanguinity, Dr. Richardson explained. When close relatives procreate, the likelihood of deleterious recessive genes manifesting increases catastrophically. The case of Timothy, a 9-year-old boy born of Jeremiah and Clara, was particularly dire. He suffered from a rare combination of congenital heart disease and nervous system defects. His life expectancy, even with intervention, was bleak. Preliminary genetic analyses indicated extreme homozygosity, a technical term for a genetic echo chamber, where identical genes from both parents create a perfect storm for mutation and disease. The mental health of the family was equally shattered. Many exhibited behaviors suggesting severe psychiatric disorders, a known risk of prolonged inbreeding. Mary Blackwood, 43, suffered from catatonia and auditory hallucinations, locked away in a cabin during her episodes, never receiving treatment. For scientists, the family represented a forbidden experiment, providing priceless, if horrifying, insights into human heredity. Yet, this raised profound ethical questions: how to balance scientific value with human dignity. An ethics committee was formed, establishing protocols that would influence future cases. For the children, like Abigail, the future was a daunting prospect. They were victims not only of genetics but of a brutal social isolation. They grew up believing their situation was normal, that the outside world was hostile, said social worker Patricia Dawson. The challenges of integration were Herculean. The local community reacted with a mixture of horror, pity, and rejection, highlighting the difficult balance between protecting victims and confronting the unsettling reality of their origins. In the next chapter, we will explore the legal battle against Jeremiah Blackwood and the complex question of justice when the perpetrator is also a product of the very hell he created. Jeremiah Blackwood's trial began in March 1968, a complex and sensational spectacle. The district prosecutor faced the unprecedented challenge of prosecuting a man who had created his own reality, a microcosm where his actions were not crimes but sacred duties. The defense argued that Jeremiah, with an IQ of 65, lacked the mental capacity to understand the criminality of his actions, a claim that sparked debates over moral relativism. The testimony of experts became central. Anthropologists, psychologists, and geneticists painted a picture of a man who was both perpetrator and victim. The most dramatic moment came when Clara was called to testify. In a voice barely a whisper, she said, "I didn't know there was another way to live, but I always knew something was wrong." When asked if she blamed Jeremiah, she replied, "He did what his father did, but that doesn't mean he should continue. Someone had to break the cycle." The jury found Jeremiah guilty but with attenuating circumstances. Judge Clarence Morris, acknowledging the unique context, sentenced the 77-year-old to 20 years in a state medical facility, a largely symbolic sentence. The case set legal precedents and forced a national examination of isolated communities. For the Blackwood family, the verdict marked the beginning of a long, painful road to recovery. In our final chapter, we will follow their fates over the ensuing decades and the lasting legacy of this American tragedy. In the decades that followed, the lives of the Blackwood survivors diverged dramatically. Jeremiah died in 1972, unrepentant, still believing in his distorted mission. Clara, showing remarkable resilience, eventually built a life of quiet dignity in a supervised community, finding small joys after a lifetime of darkness. For the younger members, like Abigail and Thomas, earlier intervention offered a chance. Abigail underwent surgeries for her scoliosis and found work in a care center. Thomas learned carpentry, eventually opening his own workshop and becoming a respected community member, though he always carried the weight of his name. Not all fared as well. Some, like Mary, required lifelong institutional care. The case left an indelible mark on science, social policy, and ethics. It contributed to the 1974 Child Abuse Prevention and Treatment Act, reshaping how agencies handle isolation as a form of neglect. The story of the Blackwoods endures as a harrowing reminder of human fragility and resilience, of the horrors born from extreme isolation, and of our collective responsibility to shed light into the darkest corners. If you have made it this far, you are part of a community that values these important, if difficult, stories. Leave a comment saying, "I watched here, so I can recognize you." Be sure to like, share this video, and subscribe so you don't miss our next investigations into the hidden chapters of history. Together, we ensure these stories are told, so they are never repeated.